You put your kid in front of a screen, they scroll, they tap, they watch. Hours pass. Then one day you notice something. They can't focus. They struggle with memory. They're anxious, stressed. What happened? Here's the twist. While screens dominate childhood, a Cambridge study tracking over 10,000 American teens just revealed something most parents miss. The kids who spent time with books, actual books for pleasure, not for school, between ages 2 and 9, they walked into adolescence with bigger brains, sharper minds, and better mental health. Not by a little, by margins that show up on brain scans, on cognitive tests, on mental health assessments. We're talking about structural differences in the temporal lobe, the frontal cortex, the insula, regions that control memory, language, attention, and emotional regulation. But here's what nobody tells you. There's a specific window, a specific number of hours. Cross that line and the benefits flatten. Miss the window and you're watching your kid's potential slip away while they stare at a screen. What does the science actually say? When should kids start? How much is enough? And why are we ignoring the one activity that rewires young brains for success? In June 2023, a research team from the University of Cambridge, Fudan University in Shanghai, and the University of Warwick published findings in psychological medicine that changed how we understand reading and brain development. Lead researcher Professor Barbara Sahakian from Cambridge's Department of Psychiatry and her colleague Professor Jianfeng Feng from Fudan analyzed data from the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, the ABCD study, the largest long-term investigation of brain development and child health in the United States. They pulled records on 10,243 young adolescents recruited from 21 research sites across America. These weren't just surveys. The team examined clinical interviews, cognitive test scores, mental health assessments, behavioral reports from parents and teachers, and brain scans, high-resolution MRI images showing cortical structure down to specific regions measured in cubic centimeters, plus baseline measurements that asked one critical question to parents. Since your child was 2 years old, has your child read for pleasure? If yes, for how many years? And approximately, how many hours per week does your child spend reading for pleasure? The numbers split clean. 48.2% of kids, that's 4,942 children, began reading for pleasure quite late in childhood or never developed the habit at all. They logged between 0 and 2.5 years of recreational reading. 40.8%, 4,172 kids, had higher levels of early reading for pleasure, spending between 3 and 5.5 years enjoying books before adolescence. The remaining 11%, 1,129 children, started reading for pleasure very early and maintained it for more than 6 years. 2300138 plus data directly from the ABCD Study Consortium coordinated at the University of California, San Diego Center for Human Development, which recruited 11,880 children across America with brain imaging protocols harmonized using 3 Tesla MRI scanners. We're not pulling this from blog posts or generic health sites. We're citing peer-reviewed neuroscience published by Cambridge University Press in an open-access format verified by institutional review boards at each of the 21 data collection sites. Now back to the information. They assessed working memory with tasks requiring kids to hold and manipulate information across several seconds. Speech development got tracked through the National Institutes of Health Toolbox, which includes picture vocabulary tests and oral reading recognition. Academic achievement came from school records, actual grades in reading, math, and science. The researchers controlled for socioeconomic status, parental education level, family income as a percentage of federal poverty guidelines, race, ethnicity, and urbanization, whether kids lived in metropolitan or rural areas. They used linear mixed models, structural equation methods for twin studies, since the ABCD cohort includes sibling pairs, and longitudinal analysis, tracking how reading habits at baseline predicted outcomes 2 years later. Then they ran something called two-sample Mendelian randomization, a technique borrowed from genetics that tests whether an association might be causal by looking at genetic variants that influence reading behavior and seeing if those same variants predict cognitive performance. It's like running a natural experiment using DNA as a randomization tool. Early initiated long-standing childhood reading for pleasure, which the researchers abbreviated as early RFP, correlated highly with performance on cognitive tests in young adolescents. Kids who read more between ages 2 and 9 scored higher on verbal learning, remembering more words from the 15-item lists. They performed better on memory assessments, both immediate and delayed recall. Their speech development showed stronger vocabulary acquisition and reading fluency. Their academic achievement tracked higher across subjects. The correlation wasn't small. It showed statistical significance even after controlling for family income, parental education, and all the other factors that typically predict school success. But cognitive performance was just the start. These early readers also showed significantly lower scores on mental health problem assessments. The study measured psychopathology symptoms using established clinical scales. Kids who read for pleasure early in life reported fewer signs of stress, less depression, reduced anxiety symptoms. Teachers and parents reported better attention spans, fewer behavioral problems like aggression or rule breaking. The children showed improved emotional stability, better self-control, more curiosity. They were easier to care for, more likely to finish tasks, better at making friends. Volumes. Not huge differences, moderate increases, but structural changes showing up consistently across multiple brain regions. The temporal lobe showed increased size, particularly areas involved in auditory processing and language comprehension, like the superior temporal gyrus, where sounds get converted to meaning. The frontal lobe, which houses executive functions, planning, decision-making, impulse control, showed increased cortical area in regions, including the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the orbitofrontal areas. The insula, a region buried deep in the lateral sulcus between the frontal and temporal lobes, showed increased volume. The insula integrates sensory information, processes emotions, and contributes to self-awareness and cognitive control. It connects to the anterior cingulate cortex, which the scans also showed as enlarged, a region critical for error detection, conflict monitoring, and emotional regulation. And intelligence. The supramarginal gyrus, adjacent to the angular gyrus, also showed structural increases. This area processes phonological information, the sound structure of language, and contributes to working memory for verbal material. The parahippocampal region near the hippocampus, critical for memory formation and spatial navigation, showed enlargement. So did the middle occipital areas involved in visual processing, the ventral diencephalon, including the thalamus, which relays sensory and motor signals throughout the brain. These weren't random regions. They mapped directly onto networks known from decades of neuroscience research to support language processing, memory consolidation, attention networks, and emotional regulation. The researchers used something called cortical parcellation, dividing the brain into specific anatomical regions based on the Desikin-Killiany atlas, a standard reference map used in neuroimaging. They measured cortical thickness in millimeters, surface area in square millimeters, and subcortical volumes in cubic millimeters. The statistical analysis accounted for total intracranial volume, because bigger brains in general don't mean better cognitive function, and they controlled for scanner effects since different MRI machines at different sites can introduce measurement variability. The results held up. Reading for pleasure during those early childhood years between 2 and 9 associated with structural brain differences visible on high-resolution imaging. That's roughly 1 hour and 43 minutes per day. Kids who hit this threshold showed maximum cognitive benefits. Above 12 hours weekly, the gains plateaued. More reading didn't produce additional improvements in verbal learning, memory, or academic performance. In fact, when kids exceeded 12 hours, significantly spending most of their free time reading to the exclusion of other activities, the researchers noted potential downsides. Too much sedentary time, reduced physical activity, less social interaction. The brain develops through diverse experiences. Physical movement activates motor systems and spatial processing. Social play builds theory of mind, the ability to understand others' mental states. Music and arts engage auditory and visual networks in different patterns than reading. A balanced childhood needs variety, but within reasonable bounds, that 12-hour weekly target emerged as a sweet spot. But on top of this, we found significant evidence that it's linked to important developmental factors in children, improving their cognition, mental health, and brain structure, which are cornerstones for future learning and well-being. The research appeared in major scientific news outlets within days. Science Daily picked it up on June 27th. CNBC covered it on July 24th, 2023. SciPost ran a detailed analysis on August 17th. The coverage emphasized a point often missed in popular discussions of screen time and child development. Reading for pleasure isn't just an alternative to screens. It's an active developmental tool with measurable neurological effects. Unlike listening, which humans do instinctively, reading is learned. It requires linking visual symbols to phonological codes, mapping letters to sounds, then sounds to meaning, all while maintaining enough working memory to hold a sentence together until the end. The brain didn't evolve for reading. Written language is too recent, only about 5,000 years old. So when a child learns to read, the brain repurposes older systems. The fusiform gyrus in the visual cortex, originally for object recognition, becomes the visual word form area specialized for recognizing letter strings. The angular gyrus links this visual input to phonological and semantic networks. The supramarginal gyrus processes sound structure. The hippocampus and parahippocampal regions bind these pieces into memories. Each time a child reads for pleasure, not under stress or for evaluation, but for enjoyment, these networks activate together. Repeated activation over months and years, especially during the critical window of brain plasticity from ages 2 to 9 when synapse density peaks and then begins pruning, strengthens these pathways. Neurons that fire together wire together. The phrase is overused, but the mechanism is real. Hebbian learning, named after Donald Hebb, who proposed it in 1949, describes how synaptic connections strengthen with repeated correlated activity. Reading for pleasure provides thousands of hours of correlated neural activity across language, memory, attention, and reward systems. The reward matters. Pleasure activates dopaminergic circuits from the ventral tegmental area projecting to the nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex. When kids read because they enjoy it, dopamine signals reinforce the neural pathways involved. That's why reading for pleasure shows stronger effects than assigned reading. Intrinsic motivation engages reward circuitry that consolidates learning processes. Reading engages the insula through emotional responses to stories. When a character faces danger, your insula processes the vicarious threat. When they experience joy, your insula simulates that feeling. This emotional engagement while reading fiction builds empathy networks. Studies using functional MRI have shown that reading literary fiction activates theory of mind networks, helping people infer others' thoughts and feelings. The Cambridge study found structural changes in the insula among early readers. These kids likely spent years processing characters' emotions, simulating social scenarios through narrative, training the neural circuitry for understanding minds. Maybe families wealthy enough to have books also provide other advantages. The Cambridge researchers addressed this by tracking kids over 2 years and by using twin studies. The ABCD cohort includes dizygotic and monozygotic twin pairs. Comparing twins who share the same family environment but differ in reading habits helps isolate the effect of reading itself. They also ran the Mendelian randomization analysis, which found that genetic variants associated with reading behavior also predicted better cognitive performance, suggesting a potential causal link rather than just correlation. The analysis controlled for genetic variants associated with educational attainment and cognitive ability, trying to separate reading's effect from general intelligence or family emphasis on education. Let's shift to the comparison group, kids who never developed the reading habit or started late. These children, nearly half the sample, showed measurably different brain structure by adolescence. Their cortical areas and language processing regions were smaller. Their cognitive test scores lagged. Their mental health problems scores ran higher. They spent more time on screens. The study measured screen time separately, asking parents about hours spent on television, smartphones, tablets, computers, and gaming devices during weekdays and weekends. Kids who read less for pleasure consistently showed higher screen time. They also slept less. Sleep duration came from parent reports and actigraphy data when available. Early readers averaged longer sleep durations, which matters because sleep consolidates memories and pruning synapses during REM cycles, essential for learning. Severe symptoms of depression, anxiety, inattention, and aggression. The effects were dose-dependent. Kids spending 7 or more hours daily on screens compared to those spending 1 hour showed more than double the rates of diagnosed depression and anxiety. Research using data from the National Health Interview Survey, covering July 2021 to December 2023, found teens with high daily screen time were 26% more likely to have depression symptoms and 27% more likely to have anxiety symptoms compared to teens with lower screen use. They also reported less social and emotional support. It simply noted that early readers spent less time on screens overall and more time engaged in the physical act of turning pages, following linear narratives, and building sustained attention. Screens encourage rapid context switching. Notifications interrupt flow. Algorithms optimize for engagement, keeping eyes glued through novelty and reward unpredictability. Reading a book requires sustained attention across minutes and hours without external interruption. That's practice for executive function, the ability to maintain goal-directed behavior in the face of distraction. Anxiety and depression. Sleep deprivation impairs prefrontal cortex function, the region responsible for emotional regulation and impulse control. Screen use before bed, particularly blue light from devices, suppresses melatonin release and delays sleep onset. Kids scrolling on phones at night sacrifice sleep, and their developing brains pay the cognitive and emotional price. Reading before bed, especially physical books without screens, provides a calming routine that transitions the brain towards sleep without melatonin disruption. 2024, the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, Volume 61, Issue 10, published 2020, and the Centers for Disease Control Preventing Chronic Disease Journal, published January 2025, analyzing National Health Interview Survey data from over 40,000 teens. We're not summarizing think pieces. We're citing longitudinal research with documented sample sizes, controlled variables, and peer review. Now back to the information. Progress in adolescence than parental education level. That study, published decades before smartphones existed, showed reading's effect independent of modern screen concerns. A more recent study led by Alice Sullivan and Matt Brown, published in 2015 in the journal Sociology of Education, used the British cohort study data to show that reading for pleasure at age 10 predicted not just literacy scores at age 16, but also math and vocabulary improvements. The effect size was substantial. Kids who read daily for pleasure scored 14% higher on vocabulary tests compared to kids who never read for pleasure. Math scores, which seem unrelated to reading, also showed gains. Reading builds background knowledge across topics. That knowledge supports problem solving and abstract reasoning in math. Research published in JAMA Network Open in July 2024 by researchers at the University of Copenhagen tested whether reducing leisure screen time improved mental health in children and adolescents. They ran a randomized trial where kids cut screen use by half for 2 weeks. The intervention group showed improvements in mental health measures compared to controls. Not massive changes, but measurable reductions in behavioral problems and improvements in prosocial behavior. The study suggested that screen time reduction, potentially replaced with activities like reading, could benefit mental health independent of other factors. Correlation isn't causation, even with longitudinal designs and Mendelian randomization. Kids who read might come from families that emphasize education, have access to books, model reading behavior. The Cambridge study controlled for socioeconomic status, but no statistical control perfectly eliminates confounding. Randomized trials, where you assign kids to read or not read, would be unethical and impractical for childhood development spanning years. So we work with observational data and the pattern across multiple studies using different populations, different countries, different time periods, all point the same direction. Reading for pleasure during the critical window of early brain development associates with better cognitive outcomes, improved mental health, and structural brain differences in regions supporting language, memory, attention, and emotional regulation. The brain plasticity window matters. The Cambridge study focused on reading between ages 2 and 9 because that's when the brain is most malleable. Synapse density peaks around age 2 to 3 with an estimated 100 trillion synaptic connections in the young brain. Then pruning begins, a process where unused connections get eliminated and heavily used pathways get reinforced with myelin, the fatty insulation that speeds neural transmission. By adolescence, the brain has lost about half its synapses, keeping the connections that proved useful. Reading during this window influences which pathways survive pruning. The left hemisphere language networks, the hippocampal memory systems, the prefrontal attention networks, they all strengthen through the repeated activation that comes from decoding text, following narratives, imagining scenes, and inferring character, motivations. Forcing a reluctant child through assigned reading doesn't engage reward circuitry the same way. Parents and teachers face the challenge of awakening that intrinsic interest. Professor Jianfeng Feng stated in the Cambridge press release, "We encourage parents to do their best to awaken the joy of reading in their children at an early age. Done right, this will not only give them pleasure and enjoyment, but will also help their development and encourage long-term reading habits, which may also prove beneficial into adult life." But when parents read for pleasure themselves, when books sit visible around the home, when reading becomes a shared activity through bedtime stories or discussing books over dinner, kids internalize that reading matters. Better emotional stability. These aren't trivial outcomes. Adolescent mental health has worsened dramatically over the past 2 decades. Teen depression rates increased 50% between 2005 and 2017, according to data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. Suicide rates among 10 to 24-year-olds increased 57% between 2007 and 2017, according to the CDC. The timing correlates with smartphone adoption, though correlation isn't proof of causation. Multiple factors likely contribute, including academic pressure, social media comparison effects, reduced sleep, and changing family structures. They experience characters facing challenges, processing feelings, making choices, and dealing with consequences. Neuroimaging studies have shown that reading activates the same brain regions involved in experiencing events firsthand. Reading about a character running activates motor cortex. Reading about a character feeling sad activates emotional processing regions. This simulation builds neural templates for handling emotions and situations before encountering them in real life. It's mental rehearsal. Screen-based entertainment often provides constant external stimulation, leaving little room for processing. Reading requires the brain to generate imagery, fill in details, construct meaning actively, rather than passively absorbing someone else's constructed visuals. That active generation strengthens neural networks in ways passive consumption doesn't. Reading a book requires sustaining focus across long periods. A chapter might take 20 minutes. A novel takes days or weeks, maintaining narrative threads across interrupted sessions. This trains working memory and executive control. In contrast, platforms like TikTok or YouTube Shorts train brains for rapid context switching, consuming content in 60-second bursts. Research shows heavy users of short-form video develop preference for novelty and struggle with sustained attention tasks. The Cambridge study didn't directly measure attention span, but it found that early readers showed improved attention and fewer symptoms of ADHD, according to parent and teacher reports. The Cambridge researchers measured verbal learning, memory, speech development, and academic achievement broadly, math scores, science scores, not just reading comprehension. This suggests a transfer effect. Skills and neural networks developed through reading support, reasoning, and problem solving across domains. The mechanism likely involves working memory. Reading builds capacity to hold and manipulate information over time. That same capacity supports mathematical problem solving, scientific reasoning, and analytical thinking. The brain's executive networks, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and parietal attention networks, support both reading comprehension and abstract reasoning. Strengthening these networks through one activity provides benefits across multiple cognitive domains. How do parents implement this in an environment saturated with screens? The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends creating a family media use plan that balances screen time with other activities. The World Health Organization suggests no screen time for children under 2, no more than 1 hour daily for ages 2 to 4, and consistent limits for older kids. But enforcement is difficult when schools assign homework online, friends communicate through messaging apps, and entertainment defaults to streaming. Parents report feeling overwhelmed trying to manage multiple devices across multiple kids with peer pressure pushing toward more connectivity. Read to children even before they can read independently. Shared reading builds vocabulary, models the reading process, and creates positive associations between books and parental attention. Make books accessible, put them where kids can reach them. Visit libraries weekly. Let kids choose books based on interest, not just educational value. Interest drives engagement, which drives the neural activation that produces learning. Set consistent reading time. 20 minutes before bed creates routine. Reading becomes part of the bedtime transition, replacing screens which disrupt sleep. Model reading behavior. Let kids see parents reading for pleasure, not just checking phones or watching TV. Discuss books. Ask questions about stories. What did the character feel? What would you have done? This extends processing beyond initial reading, deepening comprehension and emotional engagement. The goal isn't eliminating screens entirely. That's unrealistic and might backfire. The goal is balance, ensuring screens don't crowd out the activities that build developing brains. Even kids with genetic predisposition toward reading need access to books and time to read. And kids without that predisposition can develop the habit through consistent exposure and positive reinforcement. Twin studies in the ABCD cohort comparing identical twins who share all genes but differ in reading habits showed that environmental factors, shared and non-shared, played significant roles alongside genetic influences. The researchers also noted that timing matters beyond just starting early. The optimal 12 hours weekly was most beneficial when sustained across years. A burst of reading for a few months doesn't produce the same structural brain changes as consistent reading maintained across childhood. The brain responds to chronic patterns of activation, not brief intense periods. This argues for building habits rather than campaigns. Reading becomes part of life, not a special project. But the study hasn't followed kids into full adulthood yet. The ABCD study is ongoing, eventually tracking participants into their 20s and beyond. Future data will reveal whether childhood reading predicts adult outcomes, including educational attainment, career success, mental health, and life satisfaction. Studies following the British 1970 cohort into adulthood found that childhood reading habits predicted educational success, employment outcomes, and even health behaviors decades later. The mechanisms are complex. Reading builds vocabulary, which supports academic achievement, which opens educational opportunities, which affect career paths. Reading builds knowledge, which supports informed decision-making across life domains. Reading builds empathy and social understanding, which affect relationships and social networks. All these pathways compound over time, small advantages in childhood expanding into larger differences in adulthood. Intervention with potentially massive public health impact. Unlike pharmaceutical treatments, which come later after problems develop, reading is preventive. It builds the neural architecture for emotional regulation before adolescence hits with its hormonal changes and social pressures. Depression and anxiety typically emerge in adolescence. The median onset for anxiety disorders is age 11. For mood disorders like depression, it's age 13 according to the National Comorbidity Survey. If reading habits established between ages 2 and 9 strengthen brain regions and networks that resist these disorders, we're looking at primary prevention, stopping problems before they start. An hour 40 minutes daily might seem like a lot, but it's less than the average screen time for kids. According to Common Sense Media, 8 to 12-year-olds average 4 to 6 hours of screen time daily. Teens average 7 to 9 hours. Substituting even a portion of that with reading produces measurable benefits without requiring new resources, just reallocation of time already spent on entertainment. Critics might argue that correlation doesn't prove causation, that smart kids just prefer reading, or that wealthy educated families both encourage reading and provide other advantages. Those critiques have merit, No observational study perfectly isolates causation. But the Cambridge researchers addressed these concerns through statistical controls, longitudinal design, twin comparisons, and Mendelian randomization. The pattern holds across multiple analytical approaches, and the biological plausibility is strong. We know from neuroscience that repeated activation of neural circuits during development strengthens those circuits. We know reading engages language, memory, attention, and emotional networks. We know brain plasticity peaks in early childhood. The mechanism isn't mysterious. The ventral diencephalon and thalamus findings are particularly interesting. These deep brain structures relay sensory and motor signals, integrate information across cortical regions, and contribute to arousal and attention. The thalamus has been called the gateway to consciousness because it filters and routes information to the cortex. Enlargement of thalamic structures in early readers suggests enhanced connectivity and information processing capacity. This aligns with the improved attention and reduced distractibility noted in behavioral assessments. Instead, the structural changes targeted specific networks. The temporal lobe language areas, the angular and supramarginal gyri for reading comprehension and phonological processing, the hippocampus and parahippocampal regions for memory, the insula and anterior cingulate for emotional regulation and cognitive control. This pattern map directly onto what reading demands cognitively. The researchers also found that benefits appeared around 4 hours weekly. The difference between 0 hours and 4 hours of reading per week showed measurable effects. 8 hours showed further improvement. 12 hours hit the peak. This dose-response relationship strengthens causal inference. If reading had no effect, you'd expect random variation with no consistent pattern across exposure levels. The systematic increase from 4 to 12 hours followed by plateau above 12 hours suggests a real biological relationship between reading exposure and brain development. Social interaction builds theory of mind and social processing networks. Creative play builds imagination and problem solving in domains beyond language. Music engages auditory and motor networks in unique ways. Arts engage visual processing and motor control. A well-rounded childhood requires variety. The optimal zone is substantial reading, 12 hours weekly, alongside other enriching activities, not reading to the exclusion of everything else. This consistency suggests the findings reflect fundamental aspects of brain development rather than artifacts of specific cultural contexts. Networks and supports academic learning differently. Both likely provide benefits, possibly through partially overlapping and partially distinct neural mechanisms. Similarly, research might examine whether reading difficulty matters. Should kids read at their level or slightly above? Challenge builds skills, but excessive difficulty causes frustration. The optimal zone of proximal development, where material is challenging enough to require effort, but not so hard it feels impossible, probably applies to pleasure reading as much as to classroom instruction. Print allows spatial memory, recalling information based on where it appeared on the page. Print avoids the distractions of hyperlinks and notifications. Print doesn't emit blue light before bed. E-readers without backlit screens might split the difference, providing convenience of digital formats with fewer distractions than tablets or phones. But the tactile experience of holding a physical book, turning pages, seeing progress visually might contribute to engagement and memory formation in ways screens don't fully replicate. They require intention and consistency, building reading into the structure of childhood rather than treating it as an optional extra. The Cambridge findings provide evidence, but evidence alone doesn't change behavior at scale. That requires policy shifts, cultural change, and sustained effort from parents, educators, and communities. Some pediatricians are prescribing reading, giving families book recommendations at checkups. These scattered efforts show promise, but they're not yet mainstream. Intensive reading in adolescents might produce some benefits, but probably not the same structural changes achieved during the critical window when synaptic pruning and myelination are most active. The study also doesn't tell us what happens in adulthood. Do early readers maintain cognitive advantages into middle age and older adulthood? Do they show greater cognitive reserve, protecting against age-related decline and dementia? Those questions require decades of follow-up data. Neuroscience, research that's beginning but far from complete. The benefits include higher verbal learning scores, better memory, stronger speech development, improved academic achievement, fewer signs of depression and anxiety, better emotional stability, improved attention, and fewer behavioral problems. Kids who read also sleep more and spend less time on screens. We'll know whether early readers completed more education, earned higher incomes, reported greater life satisfaction, maintained better mental health, and aged more successfully cognitively. The early signs point toward yes. The British cohort data, extending into midlife, suggests yes, but we'll have confirmation, and we'll understand the mechanisms in finer detail. Reading isn't just a pleasant pastime, it's a developmental intervention with measurable neurological effects. During the critical window of early brain development, reading for pleasure strengthens the neural networks that support thinking, learning, feeling, and navigating the social world. It builds bigger brains in the specific regions that matter for cognitive and emotional function. It provides a buffer against mental health problems that typically emerge in adolescence, and it costs almost nothing beyond time and intention. Clinical scales and reports from multiple observers, and tested for causal relationships through Mendelian randomization. They published their findings in a peer-reviewed journal with open access and full methodological transparency. Their conclusion aligns with decades of prior research across multiple countries. The evidence is about as strong as observational research can provide. The Cambridge researchers discovered this by analyzing the ABCD study dataset, but they weren't the first to look at that data. The ABCD study collected information on reading habits as one variable among hundreds, tracking everything from substance use to sleep patterns to neighborhood characteristics. Reading didn't get priority status. It was just another data point. The Cambridge team had to specifically ask the question, had to decide reading was worth investigating, had to run the analysis connecting those reading questionnaires to the brain scans and cognitive tests and mental health assessments. They could have missed it. Other researchers did miss it, focusing on screen time or exercise or diet or genetics. But Professor Sahakian and Professor Fung and their colleagues asked the right question, and they found an answer with profound implications. 381. The full dataset, including brain scans and questionnaires, sits in the ABCD study repository accessible to researchers worldwide. Anyone can verify the findings. Anyone can run additional analyses. The research is transparent, open, and reproducible. Not a summary of a summary, not a cherry-picked subset. The actual data showing actual brains with measurable structural differences based on something as simple as whether kids spent time with books between ages 2 and 9.